Hi, my name is Mike Marcus. This is a repeat of a talk I gave to the MIT Club of Washington on the surprising history of Wi-Fi and why it was a good example of technical innovation. So I hope you enjoy it. And here we go with screen sharing. Okay. In this day and age, bipartisan regulation is unusual, or not common at least. And this is a good example of how it worked together to speed technical innovation in the area. Although in general, radio spectrum policy in the United States has almost always, but not always, been bipartisan. A secret revealed when FCC laid the foundation for what is now Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, it never really had a plan for radio LANs, generic name for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, for radio local area networks like Wi-Fi. Sometimes serendipity does great things. By contrast, in Europe, there was a development called HyperLAN that we'll explain in a minute that did have a plan for this type of radio LAN, but the type of industrial policy that the Europeans used in HyperLAN planning was never part of FCC's policy, and we will show you that the Wi-Fi policy was much, much more successful than the HyperLAN was. The initial goal was not to lay a foundation for radio LANs, but rather to remove barriers for new technology, as Carter's deregulation czar, Professor Alfred Kahn, had advocated as a countermeasure for the stagflation that was troubling the US economy at that time. This is how it all started. You might be surprised to see Adam Smith here, the pioneer of free markets. The action that resulted in the frequencies that were used for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth was not the result of Soviet-style industrial planning by a national government, as is common in radio frequency technology in many other countries. It resulted from the beginning of a bipartisan policy where the focus was to decrease the role of government and to leave as much as possible in the marketplace. Adam Smith was the pioneer of free market forces and talked about the invisible hand. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize in economics for many things. He though was a pioneer in the idea for radio technology, the government should stop regulating what it can be used for and focus mainly on interference issues. And closer to this particular thing was Alfred Kahn, who was a deregulatory advisor to President Carter, was a professor of economics at Cornell, and became the deregulatory czar of the Carter administration. Go in the right direction. Classic government spectrum policy literally dates back to the days of the Titanic and the sinking of the Titanic. There were a great many problems with early radio use in the Titanic disaster, and much of the loss of life was attributed to that. In the classic government spectrum policy, national governments administratively ration spectrum availability to worthy causes. Initially, maritime safety was a key issue, and frankly, in early radio technology, there wasn't much capacity for a lot of different uses, so maritime safety went to the top of the list. In classic radio policy, you judge whether a new use of spectrum was beneficial, and the government judges whether it's financially or technically possible. That is, the governments dish out spectrum for users that they find appropriate. While spectrum efficiency costs money, but since classic spectrum was free, once you convince the government that your cause was worthy, there generally was no pressure for spectrum efficiency. And in most cases at this time, there were very few technical options, so the government dictated which technical option should be used and implicitly the efficiency possible. Now, in this type of classic spectrum policy, Europe Inc., that is European governments and industries, decided that HyperLAN, a radio LAN project, would be their next GSM-like project. GSM, you may recall, was a second generation radio telephone system, and the Europeans developed it. They mandated it could be the only system used in Europe, and it was successful in Europe, not surprisingly, and then they used diplomatic pressure to get it into other countries around the world. Very different than the policies that FCC used for early cellular policy. Hyperland, though, is just a footnote to spectrum history, and many of the listeners probably never even heard of it, or another early dead end called Home RF. But here is a URL that will give you more information about that, and it is parenthetically mentioned in Wikipedia. Soviet-style planning has real problems in rapidly evolving technical areas unless it can keep everybody else out, and that's what happened in GSM. It was brilliantly successful because governments were able to forbid any other technology for cellular, and if you wanted to use cellular in many countries, you had to use GSM. This style requires governments to pick the winners and losers before the market even starts, but in the US and some other countries that initially aligned to the US, rapid freewheeling Wi-Fi evolution doomed the bureaucratic-enabled hyperland in the marketplace. And while hyperland was out there for a while, it failed in the marketplace of goods and services. And let me give you another example. Kodak now is a mere shadow of its former self. And if you go to Rochester, New York these days, it's pretty depressing where its buildings used to be. But unknown to most people, Kodak, as this picture shows, filled the first prototype of a consumer digital camera in 1973 and was seriously thinking about using digital technology as a follow-on to its classic film technology. But part of their business model was to have income related not only to sales of cameras, but to camera use, originally film and developing products. They at least wanted to keep the developing market, so Kodak had an idea to have film processing outlets, their existing franchisees, with 24/7 drive-by download by radio link from customers in the parking lot, and then you would go in and pick up the prints. This would replace the original business model of you taking your film into the photo shop. This would be a little bit faster, but would keep the same basic business model. Kodak pressed FCC for years for specific spectrum provisions for this use and only this use. This was the classic thinking. You want a new use for spectrum, you come to FCC and you beg for it, and you put FCC in the position of trying to decide whether this application was worthy. And for whatever reasons in the mid-70s, FCC decided this application of download from the parking lot of pictures from a camera wasn't worthy and never gave it, and that killed that part of Kodak's business plan. And you see where Kodak is today. Okay, let's look at the origin of this concept in my personal history. When I graduated from MIT, I came to Washington in January 1972 for military service following Air Force ROT scholarship and commissioned the Air Force. I was assigned to an obscure Air Force office in the Old Town section of Alexandria, working on nuclear test detection research. It was interesting. It was better than going to Vietnam, but it wasn't my personal thing. Ironically, in the office was John Woods, someone I knew from MIT in the class 65, now retired from RPI. And one day, John said to me, let's get out of the office for a day and go to a classified conference on new military communication systems. We obviously weren't working on communication systems, but sounded like a good idea. So John and I and one other fellow went out of the office to this one-day meeting. And it was during this meeting I had my first contact with spread spectrum communications technology, which was then rarely discussed in civilian context. Indeed, it had never been mentioned in my graduate or undergraduate studies at MIT. And I had a few questions when we got back to the office, but John Woods was very patient to me in explaining this, and I can see why he had a great career as an academic. But a little bit about what spread spectrum is. It's a technology that contradicts most assumptions of classic spectrum policy, because instead of minimizing spectrum, it sort of maximizes spectrum. Hedy Lamarr is a legendary inventor, and if you Google her and spread spectrum, you will find out a lot about that. But this technology takes a communication signal and makes it much, much wider than it would normally be, which conveys several advantages, one of which is resistance to jamming. Now, John Costas, an MIT graduate alumnus, had been working on military applications of spread spectrum for anti-jam systems and wrote a rather enigmatic 1959 journal article that showed that it might be efficient sometimes for general communications use, although that was sort of always counterintuitive. In the 1970s, the only uses of this technology were spread spectrum and generally highly classified special applications. So the basic technology was unclassified and published, but the details of how to build it and use it were generally classified. Japan's counterparts of the FCC during this period purchased a military version of spread spectrum and tested it in their laboratory, but came to the conclusion that it had no practical uses. So the civil uses were less than obvious at this time. So after I got out of the Air Force, I was going to go reinvent the world or something. But I discovered in the mid-1975s, job searches are very difficult because of the post-Vietnam economic malaise or some degree of continued stagflation. But with a combination of an MIT doctorate, recent military service, and a current high security clearance, I was very attractive to a Pentagon think tank, which had been told by the Pentagon to study the lessons learned of communications jamming in the 1973 Mideast War. So suddenly, much to my surprise, I ended up in military communications research. And it turned out that a possible countermeasure for such military jamming in combat was spread spectrum. It wasn't the only countermeasure, but it was one obvious countermeasure at the time. And suddenly the interest spurred by John Woods 2 or 3 years earlier became the focus of my work for the next few years. While I was working on this analysis of electronic warfare, I was invited in June '79 to an Army Science Board meeting in a hotel at O'Hare Airport. And the Army, being very organized, dictated where everyone would sit and put them in alphabetical order to be objective. And I was sat next to Steve Lukasik, an MIT graduate alumnus, former director of ARPA. Now, I had met Dr. Lukasik because at one point he tried to get me transferred to ARPA because he frequently came to our military office because even though it was a relatively small part of ARPA programs, it was an area which he had worked in previously and took a special interest in. He was also known to many as the person who authorized the original R&D on ARPANET, which later became Internet. But we were sitting next to each other. He parenthetically mentioned that he was about to go to FCC as chief scientist. Why? Because FCC Chairman Charles Ferris, at the lower right, fully supported Professor Kahn's deregulatory agenda. And he was looking to find promising technologies that were held back by outdated regulations and to remove needless barriers to growth and innovation to help save the US economy. So during a coffee break, Dr. Lukasik commented to me that he liked the discussion the questions and points I'd raised during this electronic warfare meeting, which was sort of related to spectrum policy, and asked me what promising radio technologies are being held back by anachronistic FCC regulations. Never thought about that much before, but it was an interesting challenge and a change of pace from military issues. So I thought about it and with a few days came back with 3 suggestions. One of which in that jargon of that day was adaptive antennas, which if you're involved in cellular technology or some variants of Wi-Fi, is today's MIMO technology, is an example of which is today's MIMO technology. It's a broader field, but MIMO is one specific example of that. Another issue I raised was millimeter wave radio, or use of frequencies above 30 gigahertz, which was being held back by FCC regulations at the time. And the third example was spread spectrum. Well, that was my ticket out of the military industrial complex into a very small civil agency, which was also interdisciplinary with lawyers and economists as peers, a very stimulating environment, at least for me. And within 2 weeks, I have a job offer from FCC and never returned to the military industrial complex. So I arrived at FCC in mid-September, and I started work on a Thursday because there was a meeting that planned for that weekend with the chairman and top staffers in a Harpers Ferry, West Virginia hotel to plan their deregulatory agenda. And like we say at MIT, this weekend meeting was a drink from a fire hose. My wife was wondering why, after I worked at this agency for only 2 days, I had to work all weekend, but that was the fire hose in the top leadership circles of FCC. It was decided to vet the 3 original radio proposals I had made to pick an initial target. And after thinking about it for a while after this meeting, it was decided spread spectrum was the most likely near-term technology. I still think that was the correct choice, although I'm not quite sure why we made it at the time. So we began an initiative to identify deregulatory barriers to spread spectrum and what the FCC would do to get out of the way of spread spectrum. Now, spread spectrum in some contexts is also known as CDMA, and this is a technology that became became a key technology in the second generation cellular system and later made Qualcomm Corporation a household name. And during this period, the two founders of Qualcomm, Andrew Viterbi and Irwin Jacobs, both MIT alumni, who had not yet started Qualcomm, spoke to me several times, visited several times to talk about FCC's views on this technology before the formation of the company. Okay. Prior to this interest in spread spectrum, as it turns out, there had been some issues at FCC on military spread spectrum, the so-called JTID system, sharing with civilian non-spread spectrum systems. And MITRE Corporation, which was a major developer of JTIDs, had given a course at FCC to explain this technology. So several staffers knew people from MITRE positively from this course, and they suggested that MITRE might be helpful for FCC looking at the options. So FCC then soon gave a contract to MITRE for $55,100, which I think is possibly the best money the FCC or the US government has ever spent. But this here is a picture of the contract of the, of the study at that time, which is available at this URL. This study goes on for 150 odd pages on various issues, but in the middle is a parenthetical comment about the possible unlicensed use of spread spectrum in the ISM bands. Those are the bands which are used generally for microwave ovens, but were also used for some military radars. But they mentioned that it was not a primary recommendation of the report, but it was a novel idea. So we proceeded to move on, and there were the promises of spread spectrum, and there was opposition, much to our amazement. The promises was you possibly could share spectrum which had conventional users with new users by diluting power and have it on the same frequencies and have it appear to be very low background noise, which would have no impact, at least in the theoretical sense. And then there was MITRE's innovative concept of sharing the spectrum that microwave ovens use, which was generally viewed as a trash ban, and the realization that microwave ovens never call and complain about interference. Maybe a simple point, but it was not immediately obvious at the very beginning. But the opposition was that FCC licensees really didn't want anyone else using their spectrum under any circumstance. And no matter what scenario, what your proposal was, they would develop a scenario, many times implausible, in which they would say, look, if this happened, you would get interference, therefore you should never even try to do it. Not just focusing on avoiding the implausible scenarios, you just shouldn't do it, and that's the best thing with, yeah. And there was another issue at the time, just as IBM was dominant in computers, there was a certain US company that was dominant in mobile radio technology, and it viewed the FCC as a gatekeeper to avoid technological surprise and new competitors. So this company, which didn't want new competitors, was very effective at lobbying FCC to keep new technologies out of the marketplace. And while this company still exists, it is very diminished in many ways and no longer has that role. So the issue became extremely contentious very quickly. The initial proposals were made in June 1981. There's a picture of me making the proposals to the FCC, and Dr. Lukasik with glasses is sitting next to me. It contained no specific proposals, but asked about many possible uses, such as the unlicensed ISM microwave oven bands, CDMA, and UWB-like use. And it is ironic that today ultra wideband is a Verizon trade name for 5G, but in the 1990s, it was a very controversial super spread spectrum technology, much wider than the spread spectrum we were thinking about, but consistent with what we were talking about. We never used the word ultra wideband. That's a later jargon, but it perhaps was consistent with what we were talking about at the time. FCC makes proposals, asks for comments, gets comments, and the comments almost universally opposed CDMA and UWB-like uses. So everything we were trying to do got severe opposition. But we were told to come back by the FCC to come back with more specific proposals, which we did in May 1984. And there is no photograph here because the whole thing was so embarrassing to FCC at that point that they did not discuss it at a public meeting. They took the option, usually for much more obscure issues, and adopted proposals that focused on the unlicensed ISM bands. Again, microwave ovens don't make complaints, and let it slip out the door without any public discussion, as was proper but unusual for new technology issues. On May 9th, 1985, FCC did make a decision. That's a picture of that day. Dr. Lukasik had gone, and Dr. Powers, his deputy, replaced him by that point. And indeed, by the time, 2 weeks before this decision was made, I had been notified and Dr. Powers had been notified that FCC maybe appreciated our work, but would we please leave in the near future. So we were both doomed by the time this meeting happened. It's interesting, even the predecessor of today's Consumer Technology Association, the people who sponsor the CES conference, were opposed to this because they didn't see any viable consumer use except that might disrupt the then cordless phone market. So they were opposed to it. In any case, rules were adopted for the ISM bands that permitted virtually any application a 1 watt power, which was an unusually high amount for unlicensed power, but there was no one they could cause interference with, allowed 6 dB antenna gain, so allowed some focusing by the antenna, but not a lot, and required the use of spread spectrum. What did we expect? The expectation at the time was not ubiquitous things that would be in your pocket. Cordless phones was mentioned as an example at that time. There was a cordless phone market for the younger generation cordless phones, were alternatives to wired telephones that you only used within your house because they had a base station in your house. They were common in the 80s. They're getting increasingly rare now. We assumed that new types of radio uses would develop faster than traditional policy mechanisms could handle. And indeed, had Kodak still been interested in their transmitting photographs from a parking lot to their store, this could have handled that. Apparently, Kodak had already lost interest in that whole idea by then, but it was a good way to handle innovative ideas. Wireless LANs were never mentioned in the decision and discussion because in reality, in 1985, while Ethernet had been invented and was being marketed, Ethernet was rare outside R&D facilities. I can never remember seeing Ethernet in a general purpose office until 1987. I was aware of it, but it just was not something you would see in a non-technical office. However, in 1987, someone asked me to write a paper on radio LANs where I did mention that spread spectrum and unlicensed ISM could be used as an option. It is puzzling to me whether anyone ever read this paper or if it had an impact, but indeed, at least by 1987, I was thinking about radio LANs, but I don't know if that made any impact on anyone. What did happen? Well, it turns out radio LANs became the main but not the exclusive application of this. Although in the 90s and up to around 2005, actually there were cordless phones sold in this market. They have since disappeared because a European technology in a different band, which doesn't use spread spectrum, has taken over the cordless phone business, but there was a 10-year period where cordless phones were common. Technological Darwinism became a key driver in radio LANs. Indeed, the very first product that was approved for this technology is this 1988 product by a company called Telesystems Canada, which was a radio LAN, much slower than later Wi-Fi, but it was a pioneering market, pioneering device in this market. There were even niche radio LANs that got attention, and particularly there was a Gambate system that was used for wireless interconnection of digital musical instruments. A rather niche application, but it turned out it was very popular among professional musicians. And after the product was discontinued, the professional musicians begged the original developers to produce some more of it. So that's a true niche application. Darwinism became an effective alternative to GSM-like or Soviet central planning, and we had all these things developing. And indeed, the birth of Wi-Fi goes back to this last system here that we'll go into more in a second. Okay, enter NCR. NCR, as you can see in the upper right, is the old National Cash Register Company, originally for many years in Dayton, Ohio. And it was thinking of the feasibility of a radio LAN to be marketed under FCC rules. Why? PC-based cash registers were a major product for department stores. And indeed, selling PCs and mainframe computers to department stores were key NCR product lines at the time. So they had gotten away from the mechanical cash registers. They had a computer line, and they wanted to connect PC-based cash registers to their mainframes to continue their service to large retail stores. While in small stores, it was easy to use wired Ethernet to connect digital cash registers with mainframes, they discovered that in many department stores, it was difficult to do, both because of the cement floors and because department stores like to rearrange where they put the cash registers on a frequent basis on their main selling floor. So it would be important for their marketing of cash registers and mainframes to have a wireless connection. And the only people in the NCR corporate R&D community who had experience with radio technology was an NCR lab near Utrecht, the Netherlands, in a town at the bottom of this thing called Nieuwegein, which is hard for Americans to pronounce, right down here. And they were given the job of developing this technology because their US R&D people had no experience in radio technology. So they developed the early Wi-Fi system, but soon demand for higher and higher speeds developed. And in the people who developed 802.11g, which was a breakthrough in speed, I believe getting above 100 kilobits, couldn't achieve that using the original rules. So FCC dropped that requirement. But frankly, the requirement was to demonstrate that spread spectrum had useful applications. And in that time, CDMA was a big success. So there was no need to force people to use spread spectrum, although many of the uses still do use spread spectrum. Independently, Bluetooth was developed to share spectrum with complementary uses like Wi-Fi. And it's interesting that smartphones now have both. So clearly, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are complementary to each other. But there were other unexpected variants of ISM band use using this technology. Many utility meter readers now use this technology or a variant of this technology. So do wireless computer mouses. There are security systems that are based not on communications, but detect changes in received RF signals by people moving around a premises. It's certainly an unexpected use. And also some GPS systems use Wi-Fi signal detection to augment the GPS location. So it's interesting when you have very open-minded regulations, all sorts of unexpected uses come out that you never could have imagined. My personal odyssey after this was that, as I mentioned, that the FCC got fed up with the then management of the Office of Science Technology for creating this technology that initially was very controversial and had no near-term uses, so they thought. So several people were transferred to places. Dr. Powers was forced into early retirement. For the next 6 years, I was told to work on radio monitoring techniques from the high-tech viewpoint, first starting with an obscure issue of looking at Soviet jamming of Voice of America, but that led to techniques for looking at signal analysis for other uses. And the most fun part was confirming the source of the 1987 jamming of the Playboy satellite signal and the resulting criminal trial. I went off for 6 months to Japan for an exchange assignment. And while there, happened to notice a 50 gigahertz commercial system that was being sold that they never talked about much. And it suddenly struck me that my initial proposal for millimeter wave had really become practical. So when I came back to FCC, I proposed the 60 gigahertz unlicensed system, which had a big impact on the millimeter wave version of 5G, which is now coming into development. And then with the Clinton administration in 1993, I apparently was forgiven for the controversies that were associated with this policy and was restored back to the spectrum policy realm. It's interesting to see the continuing Darwinism, which is going on here. The 900 megahertz ISM band was the home of some of the initial radio LANs, but hasn't been used much today. And in September '99, Amazon proposed a new 900 megahertz band network that they're using on for devices like sensors and smart lights. And so even now, new uses are trying to be developed for those rules. And because they're deregulatory, it doesn't really matter. And if Amazon gets this to work, they don't have to ask anyone for permission for it. So the conclusions I have now is that traditional spectrum policy can be very time consuming for introducing new uses because it means the government has to decide whether new use is good or bad and what technology should be used. The searching for spectrum regulations are outdated by technology can be very beneficial. No matter how farsighted you are when you write regulations, they become obsolete with changes in technology. And spectrum incumbents prefer not to have such changes, but it may often be in the public interest to search for such changes. Deregulation of spectrum uses can speed new radio uses to the market has to be chosen carefully to limit adverse potential, both the spectrum and the detailed rules, to make sure none of the incumbents get unreasonable interference. And it must check the null hypothesis. That is, when you create a new rule, you also always have to consider the possibility of what happens if no one is interested in new technology, and make sure it doesn't hurt incumbents for doing that. So I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And that's it.